Let's launch into Genesis 1, which might not say what you think it does. In the beginning. That's how the Bible starts off, and it seems natural. Realize, however, that the religious literature of many ancient peoples does not begin with the story of creation. There's a point to putting the creation story first. The Bible could begin with the story of Abraham and continue through his descendants and tell how Moses at Mount Sinai receives the Torah and perhaps with it the story of creation. But putting the story of creation first is a way of stating the philosophical truth that Israel's God is not limited to Israel alone. Israel's God is the creator of everything. So, as I said earlier, sometimes it's best to imagine how one of Israel's ancient neighbors would have seen this text. I'm going to imagine Bill the Babylonian is being read or recited Genesis 1, but we could pick any imaginary neighbor of ancient Israel. In the beginning of God creating, whoa, hold on a minute. You left something out. Where did this God come from? You see, Genesis begins from a comparative literature perspective in mid-story. All ancient creation accounts of the ancient Near East told you how the gods came to be. That's called a theogony, and Genesis doesn't have one. There's no story of the origin of God, the Israelite God, who we will see is named Yahweh. And that absence of a theogony is a theological point. Systematic theologians would write, God is omnipresent, eternal. And you will hear me say many times in this course, Israel doesn't write philosophy. They won't use those big words. They'll make the same argument here by omitting part of the story. Not only is there no story of God's creation, there's no penetrating before God's creating act. This is the first of many ways Israel broke with the mythology of their neighbors. One of the points of this text is that the world is not a chaos of mutually opposed forces, that the sun and the moon are not deities, and the sky is not full of divinities. All of this comes from one God. God saw that it was good, and there was evening, and there was morning, the fourth day. So, if I'm Bill the Babylonian, and I've been listening to you patiently to this point, now I have to burn you at the stake, because now you've committed blasphemy. You've just turned two of the most important gods of the ancient world, the sun and the moon, into lampposts whose function is to tell you what day it is. This is a radical statement. And the last words of verse 16, and the stars. In that aside, a dozen gods have been dismissed. This sort of monotheism was unimaginable in the ancient world. So when Genesis 1 says that humanity is the tselem of God, it's saying if you really want to relate to God, relate to your fellow man. I think this is the basis for Israel being able to say that your relationship to other people is of crucial importance to your relationship to God. Because humans are understood as the place where God can be truly encountered. And this fact explains, too, the commandment not to make an image of this God. You don't make an image of God because he's already made one, and it's the person sitting next to you. Now, this idea of a human person being the tselem of a God is not unique to Israel. In the ancient Near East, the human king, the national ruler, was frequently referred to as the tselem of their God. The king was in the image and likeness of God. And sometimes the king is even called the tselem and the demut. The shock value of Genesis 1 here for a non-Israelite would not be the idea of a human being in the image and likeness of God. The shock value is that it's every human, not just the king. The ditch digger is the tselem of God. A woman is the tselem of God. This is a radical democratization of the concept. Very good reason for this. The concept of authorship was really a Greek notion. We don't know who wrote most of the literature of the ancient Near East. The Greeks were into authorship. Homer wrote the Odyssey, Plato wrote the Republic. So when Greek thought and Greek rule sweeps the Near East, then the notion of authorship finally is important even to the Jews. On the other hand, the idea that maybe Moses didn't write all of the Pentateuch is not some modern scholar's theory. Already in the 4th century CE, the Christian writer Jerome wrote, "Whether you prefer the view that Moses was the author of the Pentateuch or that Ezra edited it, in either case, I make no objection." Jerome is reporting that there are people around him who think Ezra is responsible, at least for the final form of the Pentateuch as we have it. Ezra was a priest and scribe who lived in the Persian period around 400 BCE in Jerusalem. The modern quest to understand the authorship of the Pentateuch only took off in the 18th century, a task called source criticism. And the results of that quest are traditionally associated with a 19th century German scholar named Julius Wellhausen. Although Wellhausen did not create this theory, he merely brought together work a lot of other people had been doing. But his name is inextricably linked with source criticism because we're still using Wellhausen's terminology, even though that too he borrowed from other people. Allowed Wellhausen and those around him to say there were 4 sources. The 4-source theory, or the documentary hypothesis, is an answer to the process of source criticism. 4 sources. We don't need to spend a lot of time on them, and I'll tell you why in a minute. Traditionally, Genesis 1, which we've been reading, is called the priestly writer, or simply P. Supposedly P is the latest of all of the sources and comes from around 400. In other words, exactly the time of Ezra. You wonder if whoever Jerome knew that argued Ezra was responsible for the last editing of the Pentateuch must have been on to the same things that Wellhausen's predecessors were on to. Chapter 2 of Genesis, on the other hand, is supposedly from the oldest of the 4 sources, the Yahwist, or J. J and not Y for Yahwist, because Wellhausen's writing in German and there's no Y in German. Supposedly the Yahwist or J source was from the 10th century BCE, the time of Solomon. The other 2 sources fit in between so that the 4 sources of the Pentateuch were J, E, D, and P. I'm not going to explain E and D. I'm not going to explain this theory much further because, to be honest, in spite of what you might read in Bible footnotes or every Bible as literature textbook, almost no scholar buys this anymore. On the other hand, scholars in the last 20 years have also pointed out that the text is really too disparate to do source criticism. In other words, it's one thing to notice that Moses can't go up the mountain if he's already at the top, and that he can't be at the top with 7 people if he went up with 2. A computer could do that kind of thing that we called step 1. But combining the sources from one story with those of another story, what I called step 2, is extremely subjective, based on perceived similarities in the eye of the beholder. We're on thin ice to narrow down the number of sources in the Pentateuch to anywhere close to 4. And these 4 documents make too much unity. So where are scholars now on this? Source criticism is still very useful. Biblical scholars couldn't work without it, couldn't make sense of Exodus 24 without it. But the composition of the Pentateuch was much more complex as it progressed and more coherent in its final form than past scholarship allowed. The way I put it for students is, the Pentateuch was written by one author, who was not Moses, or by hundreds of authors, but not by four.